There's a rule, unwritten but old as the stars themselves, that every spacefaring civilization learns eventually. Some learn it through diplomacy, some through war, some through the slow, grinding humiliation of being outsmarted by a species they never took seriously. The Vorkai learned it through a child. Her name was Maya. She was 11 years old. She had a gap between her front teeth, a ratty red backpack covered in iron-on patches of constellations she'd named herself, and a habit of talking to things that couldn't talk back. Robots, vending machines, her dad's old truck, the satellite dish on the roof of the research station where she lived on the edge of nowhere, Kepler 9 outpost, the loneliest rock in the rim. She had no idea that the fate of the entire human diplomatic corridor rested on what she decided to do in the next 72 hours. Neither did anyone else. The Vorkai had been watching the rim stations for 3 years before they made contact. That was the thing about them. Patience wasn't a virtue for the Vorkai. It was a biological function, same as breathing. They were tall, gray-skinned, with forearms that folded at odd angles, and eyes like polished obsidian, set wide and flat faces built for scanning horizons. Their ships ran cold and dark because their homeworld sun had dimmed 600 years ago, and they'd had to learn to live in the long dark of a dying sky. It made them methodical, careful. They did not move until they had counted every variable. They had counted humanity's variables. It was not a flattering count. Humans were chaotic, biologically inefficient, emotionally volatile in ways that the Vorkai's linguistic databases struggled to catalog. A species that could laugh and weep at the same stimulus that built art out of grief and weapons out of curiosity, and somehow called both of those things progress. Their children were especially baffling. Small, soft, largely non-functional for years after birth, requiring enormous resource investment with wildly unpredictable returns. The Vorkai had run the calculations. Humanity ranked 23rd out of the 27 known spacefaring species. Not dangerous, not strategically significant. What they were, however, was conveniently located. The rim outpost sat on the edge of a shipping corridor the Vorkai had been trying to claim for 2 generations. A quiet acquisition, a formal territorial negotiation, weighted in the Vorkai's favor by the simple arithmetic of who had more ships, more resources, more leverage. Kepler 9 was the first station on the list. Population 12. A skeleton crew of researchers, 2 maintenance engineers, 1 communications officer, 1 station medic, and 1 11-year-old girl who was only there because her father ran the atmosphere monitoring systems, and there was, as he often apologized to her, absolutely nowhere else for her to go. The Vorkai sent 1 ship, a diplomatic vessel, a show of restraint. Commander Sevikorn arrived at Kepler 9 at 0400 station time, which meant everyone was asleep except the night cycle monitoring systems, and 1 small human sitting cross-legged on the external observation deck in a magnetic clamp chair, wearing a parka 3 sizes too big and eating crackers out of a foil sleeve while staring at the stars. Maya heard the docking clamp before the station's proximity alert did. She'd been modifying the alert threshold for a week. She thought it triggered too late and kept complaining about it to her father, who kept saying he'd look at it when he had time, which was the adult version of never. So she'd been running her own watch. She had a tablet, a star map, a list of 17 ships she'd logged manually in the last 2 months, cross-referenced with the public shipping manifests, because 3 of them hadn't matched, and she wanted to know why. She knew the profile of a Vorkai diplomatic vessel the way she knew the profiles of most ships, from the database she'd built herself, because the station's library was 3 years out of date, and she'd been bored. The ship docking at Bay 2 had a Vorkai energy signature. There were no Vorkai ships on any filed flight plan within 40 light minutes of Kepler 9. Maya ate her last cracker, looked at the ship, looked at her tablet. She pulled up the station's internal comm, keyed her father's channel, and said, "Dad, wake up. We have company that didn't RSVP." Director Aiden Reyes was, by any metric, a good scientist, a decent father, a man who had spent 12 years on RIM postings and still, in his bones, believed that most things worked out because most situations were manageable with enough calm and enough coffee. He was not calm by the time he reached the command deck. There were 6 Vorkai standing in the airlock corridor. Commander Sevikorn at the front, taller than the door frame required him to be, which Maya would later describe as a power move, wearing formal diplomatic bands across all 4 of his wrists, his obsidian eyes doing that scanning thing where they moved independent of each other and made humans feel like exhibits in a museum. The station crew had assembled. Reyes, Dr. Okafor, the medic engineer Yun, and communications officer Hessa, who was already tried patched through to the Rim Authority on a channel that was inconveniently experiencing solar interference. Maya stood at the back. Her father had told her to stay in her bunk. She had considered that request and decided it was not going to work for her schedule. Sevikorn's translator ran a half-second behind his actual words, which gave his speech a faint echo quality, like hearing someone talk in a room just before you walk into it. Station Kepler 9, he said. We are here to formalize the transfer of territorial designation for this sector under Vorkai, Corridor Mandate 7. Your station falls within the boundaries of the renegotiated Rim partition, effective upon signature of the transition documents. You have 48 hours to review and comply. Reyes stared at him. Sorry, I need to contact the Rim Authority before I can. Your communications are, we understand, currently disrupted. The way Sevikorn said it, flat and factual, it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like weather, like he was noting that rain was occurring, and wasn't that a coincidence? Reyes understood what it was anyway. Hessa caught his eye. She shook her head. The disruption wasn't natural. We will return in 48 hours, Sevikorn said. We expect compliance. He turned. His delegation turned with him, all 4 of them moving with that Vorkai exactness, uniform and choreographed as if they'd rehearsed, which they probably had. Maya watched them go. She had been watching Sevikorn's face the whole time. Not his words, his face. The way his eyes had moved, cataloging the room, cataloging them, pausing for a fraction of a second at each person before moving on. Counting. He'd paused at her last, and then his gaze had moved on. She filed that. The first 6 hours were what Maya privately called the adults panicking quietly phase, which was a phase she had significant experience with. Her father ran calculations on the territorial claim. Dr. Okafor kept trying to reach the authority. Engineer Yun checked the docking bay 3 times to make sure the Vorkai ship wasn't doing anything to their hull while it sat there, patient and cold and dark. No one had a plan. Maya went to her bunk, opened her personal tablet, and started reading everything she could find about the Vorkai. Not the diplomatic summaries, not the species profile in the station library, which was again 3 years out of date. She went into the raw data, trade manifests, territorial records, the dry bureaucratic language of Vorkai corridor mandates, which she had to read 3 times because the translation syntax was dense and poorly formatted. She also pulled up every record of Vorkai, first contact scenarios she could find. There were 11. 6 had resulted in the smaller party complying. 4 had resulted in prolonged diplomatic disputes that eventually resolved in the Vorkai's favor anyway, because they were patient and they could wait. 1 had resulted in a standoff that lasted 8 years before both parties negotiated a shared corridor. She looked at the pattern. The Vorkai always won the waiting game. They always had more ships. They always had more leverage. They always presented their territorial claims as formalities rather than threats, which made them very hard to refuse without looking aggressive. But the one standoff, the 8-year one, had happened because the other party had found something in the Vorkai's own mandate language. A provision, a clause. It was small and technical, and it had taken their legal team 4 months to find it. Maya read the clause. She read it again. She looked at Corridor Mandate 7, which was the specific document Sevikorn had cited. She got up and went to find her father. Dad, she said. She was standing in the doorway of the command deck, red backpack over one shoulder, tablet in both hands. The mandate has a residency exemption. Reyes turned. He had the particular look of a man who had not slept and was now being interrupted mid-panic by someone he loved, but did not currently have the bandwidth to process. Maya, I told you to mandate 7, subsection 14, paragraph 3. She held up the tablet. Territorial corridor claims are invalidated within a 12 light-minute radius of any installation with documented continuous human residency of 6 years or more, provided residency predates the filing date of the mandate. Silence. Kepler 9 was established 9 years ago, she said. Mandate 7 was filed 4 years ago. We're inside the 12 light-minute radius. More silence. Hessa turned slowly from her console. Dr. Okafor looked up from her own screen. Engineer Yun stepped out of the back corridor where he'd been rerouting power. That's, Reyes started. Their own rule, Maya said. They can't take the station. Not legally. Not under Mandate 7. Her father stared at her. Then at the tablet. Then at her again. How did you? I was bored, she said. Also, I've been reading Vorkai territorial law for about 3 hours. It's actually kind of interesting if you get past the formatting. There was a problem, of course. There was always a problem. The residency exemption required proof of continuous documented habitation, sensor logs, life support records, biological presence verification registered with RIM authority. Kepler 9 had all of that. What it didn't have was a way to transmit it, because the Vorkai's interference was blocking all outbound communications. Without transmission to RIM authority, the exemption couldn't be officially filed. And the Vorkai knew about the exemption. They had to. It was their own law, which meant the communication disruption wasn't a coincidence or a power play. It was precise. They blocked the channel specifically to prevent the exemption from being filed before the 48 hours expired. Maya sat with that for a while. 42 hours left. She walked out to the observation deck, looked at the Vorkai ship sitting in Bay 2. Cold and dark and patient. She looked at the satellite dish on the roof. The dish was rated for standard RIM authority frequencies. It was also, she had been meaning to mention this to her father for a while, broadcasting on a slightly wrong frequency because of thermal drift in the calibration hardware, which she had been adjusting manually for months by climbing up on the roof and tweaking the alignment by hand because the automated system was broken and her father kept saying he'd look at it when he had time. She thought about the Vorkai interference field, thought about its frequency range. She'd pulled the technical specs from the ship's public broadcast signature. The interference was tuned to standard RIM authority frequencies. It was not tuned for a dish broadcasting on a slightly wrong frequency due to thermal drift. Maya looked at the dish, looked at the Vorkai ship, put her tablet in her backpack, zipped it up, went to find her climbing harness. It was -40 outside the station hall. The magnetic clamps on her boots made each step feel like pulling her feet out of concrete. The stars were hard and blue, and there were so many of them that the darkness between them barely registered, just the stars, wall to wall, more real and more close than they ever looked through glass. She loved it out here. She always had. It was the one place where being 11 and small and stuck on a rock at the edge of the galaxy didn't feel like a limitation. Out here, the scale was honest. Everything was enormous. She was enormous, too, just a different kind of enormous, the kind made of carbon and water and nerve endings and 9 years of reading everything she could get her hands on because there was nothing else to do. She reached the dish, pulled out her toolkit, started adjusting the alignment by another 3 degrees off standard, widening the drift, making it more wrong on purpose, nudging it into a frequency band so far off the Vorkai interference range that it might as well not exist to them. The dish wouldn't broadcast far. The wrong frequency would degrade over distance. But there was a relay buoy 12 light minutes out. She'd logged it herself 3 months ago because she'd been bored in mapping the local relay network. And if she could hit the buoy would carry the signal to the next relay, and the next, and somewhere down that chain was a RIM authority monitoring station that would pick it up. It would take hours. She had 41. She finished the adjustment, climbed back down, went inside, sat at her personal console, and started composing the most careful, precise, legally formatted communication she'd ever written in her life, citing Mandate 7, subsection 14, paragraph 3, attaching 9 years of Kepler. 9 habitation records, life support logs, biological presence verification, and every piece of documentation the exemption required. She sent it. Then she went to bed because there was nothing else to do, and she was tired, and her father always said that running on no sleep made bad problems worse. She set her alarm for 6 hours out. In Bay 2, the Vorkai ship sat cold and dark. Sevik reviewed his timeline, reviewed the communication disruption, reviewed the station manifest he'd compiled. 12 humans, thoroughly accounted for. Scientists, engineers, a medic, 1 child, non-functional, irrelevant. 40 hours left. He was patient. He had run all the variables. He went to rest. Maya's alarm went off. She looked at her tablet. 3 relay confirmations. The signal had jumped. She allowed herself exactly 1 fist pump, alone, in her bunk in the dark. Then, she got up and went to check on the stars. 35 hours to go. And, somewhere out in the relay chain, a message was moving faster than the Vorkai's patience. They just didn't know it yet. The relay confirmation sat on Maya's screen like a small, warm thing she wanted to protect. 3 jumps. The signal had made 3 relay jumps, which meant it was out of the Vorkai interference field entirely, riding the network toward the Rim Authority monitoring grid with a kind of dumb, reliable momentum that she found deeply reassuring. Signals didn't get tired. Signals didn't second-guess themselves. They just went where you pointed them. She'd pointed hers well. The problem, and there was still a problem, there was always still a problem, was that she had no way to know if anyone at the authority end was actually reading it. The monitoring grid ran automated triage. 40,000 stations broadcasting routine data all day, every day. Her message had a priority flag on it, but she'd had to code that flag herself using the station's basic comms library, and she wasn't entirely sure she'd gotten the Rim Authority priority taxonomy right because the documentation for it was, in her extensive experience with station library databases, criminally incomplete. She had 33 hours. She went to find her father. Aiden Reyes had not slept. Maya could tell by the specific quality of stillness around him. Not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a man who had been running calculations so long that his body had simply stopped sending the move-around signals and was just sitting there being a container for his brain. He had the territorial documents open on 3 screens. The exemption clause she'd found. The habitation records. A legal glossary of Vorkai mandate language that he'd apparently pulled from somewhere and was cross-referencing line by line. He looked up when she came in. She showed him the relay confirmations. He looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he put his face in his hands. Not crying. Just the kind of thing a person does when the tension they've been holding suddenly shifts and there's nowhere for it to go except down into the palms, into a few seconds of pressure that isn't quite relief yet, because relief requires certainty, and this wasn't certain yet. You went outside, he said from behind his hands. I used a harness. Maya, the interference field only covers standard frequencies. I just needed to get the dish broadcasting outside the cover band. The thermal drift was already most of the way there. I just had to Maya. He took his hands away, looked at her. The look was complicated. She'd cataloged most of her father's looks over 11 years, and this one was a combination she'd only seen twice before. Terrified and proud are not ingredients that usually go together, but in him they occasionally cooked up something that resembled awe. You climbed the exterior of a space station at -40 in the middle of a diplomatic standoff. I used the harness, she said again. That is not the part I'm worried about. The part you should be focused on is that the message got out, she said. We have 33 hours. The authority gets it in time. We cite the exemption. Mandate 7 is void. The Vorkai have to leave. Right? He was quiet for a moment. Not the running calculations quiet. A different quiet. Like he was figuring out how to say something. Right, he said. In theory. But the Vorkai are going to know something happened when they don't see us folding. They're going to push. And if they push before the authority responds, then we stall, Maya said. He looked at her. We need 33 hours, she said. We just need to keep them from doing anything drastic for 33 hours. So we stall. We make it look like we're considering compliance. We ask questions. We request clarification on mandate language. We make them explain things in detail. She pulled out her tablet. I have a list. The list had 47 items. Maya had built it overnight, pulling from everything she'd found about Vorkai diplomatic protocol. The thing about the Vorkai, the thing their profile kept circling without quite landing on, was that they were methodical to the point of compulsion. They ran process. They followed procedure. And if someone invoked their own procedural language back at them, they were constitutionally obligated to respond to it. It was, she had decided, their most exploitable feature. Item 1 on the list: request formal verification of mandate filing date and jurisdiction scope. The Vorkai were required, under their own protocol, to provide full documentation when challenged. That documentation would take time to produce. Item 2. Request clarification on the definition of continuous habitation as applied to research station classifications versus residential designations. Also required. Also time-consuming. Item 3 through 12 were variations on the same theme. Technical questions, definitional challenges, procedural requests, all drawn directly from Vorkai mandate language, so they couldn't be dismissed as bad faith. Items 13 through 22 were longer, more complex. Cross-reference between subsections. Maya had found 3 places in Mandate 7 where the language contradicted itself. Minor things, probably errors in the translation layer, but real enough to flag and real enough to demand clarification on. She showed her father the list. He read it. Then read it again. You wrote this last night, he said. Early morning, technically. You're 11. The birthday's in April, so actually I'll be Maya. He closed his eyes briefly. Okay. Dr. Okafor has some diplomatic training from her field rotation at the authority. She can front this. I'll handle the documentation requests. Hessa can run the communication log. We'll set up a formal review session. We should also feed them, Maya said. Her father blinked. What? Vorkai diplomatic protocol requires that when a formal review session is invoked, the host party provides sustenance appropriate to the receiving delegation. It's in a protocol manual. If we set up the food right, the setup and service procedure alone adds about 40 minutes. She paused. I found a Vorkai dietary specification list in the trade records. We don't have any of the actual foods, so we need to offer alternatives, which requires a formal equivalency negotiation, which is another 40 minutes, her father said slowly. Minimum. He stared at her for a moment with that complicated look again. Get Hessa, he said. Sevikorn received the formal review request at hour 6 of his patient's window. He looked at it. Looked at his second, Teravash, who was running their own documentation check. They are challenging the mandate, Teravash said. It was not quite a question. They are invoking procedural review, Sevikorn corrected, which is within their rights. It is also, in my experience, a stalling tactic by parties who have not accepted reality. Should we decline? Sevikorn considered. Declining a formal procedural review would be a diplomatic violation. It would hand the humans grounds for complaint when the authority eventually cleared and reached them. And the humans could not reach the authority. He was certain of that. The interference field was precisely calibrated. They would run their review. It would consume time, which they had less of than they knew. Then they would comply. We accept, he said. Prepare the documentation. He was patient. He had run all the variables. The review session was held in the station's main common room, which was the largest space Kepler 9 had, and was furnished primarily with bolted-down tables and a coffee maker that Hessa had once described as the beating heart of the station. Dr. Okafor sat across from Sevikorn. Reyes sat beside her with the documents. Hessa ran the official log. Maya was not officially present. She was in the kitchen adjacent to the common room, where a pass-through window gave her a clear sight line to Sevikorn's face, and she was monitoring the session on a tablet and passing notes to Hessa through a small slot under the window, because she had measured the slot earlier and confirmed her tablet could fit through it. The first 2 hours were exactly what she'd planned. Dr. Okafor was good, better than Maya had expected. She had that quality of asking questions in a tone that suggested she was genuinely interested in the answer, which made it harder to read as hostile. She walked through the mandate language with Sevicorn point by point, requesting clarification, logging responses, asking follow-up questions that branched from his answers, and required additional clarification. Sevicorn answered everything. Thoroughly. He could not. His own protocol required it. But she could see, through the pass-through window, the small shifts in his posture. The way his secondary eyes, the ones that usually scanned the room independently, kept coming back to the kitchen window, as if he was recalculating something. Maya ducked below the window, waited, came back up slowly. His eyes moved on. The food negotiation took an hour and 12 minutes, which was better than Maya had projected. The dietary equivalency request. How do you approximate Vorkai, sun-grain protein in a station kitchen that ran primarily on hydroponic spinach and soy derivatives? Generated a 20-minute side discussion that Sevicorn was constitutionally required to engage with because it fell under the hospitable accommodation clause. Maya passed a note to Hessa. Ask about the subclause on seasonal preparation variations. Hessa looked at the note, looked at the window, passed the question to Dr. Okafor. Another 14 minutes. By hour 5, they were on item 11 of the list. 20 hours remained on the Vorkai deadline. Sevicorn called a recess. He stood outside the common room in the corridor with Teravash and spoke in rapid Vorkai, below the translator threshold, which he assumed the humans did not speak. Maya spoke approximately 60 words of Vorkai, because she had been learning from a trade language database for 4 months because she had been bored. 60 words was not enough to translate the conversation. It was enough to catch 3 of them. She caught recalculate, frequency, and one word she didn't know. She looked it up quickly on her tablet. That translated loosely as the thing that shouldn't be possible. She pressed herself against the kitchen wall and thought very carefully. The frequency word meant he was thinking about the communications. He had either noticed something or he was running a new check. If he ran a check on the dish, she had 43 words on the item list remaining. She had 20 hours left. She had a relay signal in the chain that she couldn't speed up. She also had something else. She had the station's internal diagnostic system, which she had been given access to 2 years ago when her father had started letting her assist with monitoring. The diagnostics ran on a separate closed-loop network, which the Vorkai interference field had not targeted because it wasn't a broadcast system. The diagnostics could, if she pushed the sensor array, create a signal echo that would look from outside the station like active broadcast interference of its own. White noise scattered across a dozen frequencies, wide enough to mask the fact that one of those frequencies was currently carrying something important. It would drain the sensor array's power reserve. It would take 3 hours to set up. It would look, from a Vorkai technical read, like the station's old equipment was malfunctioning. Kepler 9's equipment was genuinely and documented, always malfunctioning. She had the maintenance logs to prove it. She typed a message to her father's personal tablet. For lines. Very fast. Then, she slipped out the back of the kitchen before the recess ended, went to the engineering bay, and started building the noisiest, most convincing malfunction the station had ever produced. It took 3 hours and 20 minutes. Engineer Yin found her halfway through and looked at what she was doing for a long moment without saying anything. Then, he pulled a stool up next to her and started helping because he was an engineer and she was clearly doing something that needed doing, and that was all he required. They didn't talk much. He handed her components. She connected them. He double-checked her work without making a performance of it, just quiet verification, the kind of respect that doesn't announce itself. When it was running, he leaned back and looked at the sensor array humming its fake malfunction into the dark around the station. Will it work? He asked. Long enough, she said. He nodded. That was the kind of answer he understood. Sevicorn's technical scan came back 2 hours later. The station was apparently broadcasting incoherent sensor noise across multiple frequencies due to equipment degradation, standard for an aging RIM station with a maintenance backlog of, according to the public records, 11 documented system faults. The interference the Vorkai system had been tracking, degraded, scattered, indistinguishable from equipment failure. No outbound signal detected. He filed it, returned to the review session, continued answering procedural questions about Mandate 7, which the human doctor kept finding new things to ask about, with a thoroughness that was beginning to feel. He would not use the word respect because it wasn't quite that, like something he had not calculated. 16 hours left. Maya, back in the kitchen, was on item 31 of the list. She had fallen asleep briefly against the wall. Maybe 20 minutes. Her neck hurt. She passed another note through the slot. Hessa looked at it, looked at the window. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite a smile, but had the same internal shape, the recognition of something being done carefully and well. She passed the question to Dr. Okafor. Sevikhorn answered it. Thoroughly. He could not. The relay signal was somewhere in the chain. Riding frequency bands the Vorkai didn't know to look for, carrying 9 years of habitation records and one very carefully formatted legal citation. 12 hours left. Maya ate the last of her crackers, looked at the stars through the kitchen porthole, counted them, waited. 12 hours. Maya had done the math. So many times the numbers had stopped feeling like numbers and started feeling like texture. 12 hours was a surface with edges she could run her fingers along, find the worn spots, feel where it might give. The relay signal had to reach the authority grid. The automated triage had to flag it as priority. A human, a real one, at a desk, drinking whatever people at RIM authority drank at whatever time it was in the central corridor, had to read it, verify the exemption, and initiate a response. All of that in 12 hours. She had, for the first time since this started, no move left to make. The list was still going, Dr. Okafor was on item 39, running a masterful extended question about the juridical distinction between administrative corridors and transit corridors under Vorkai territorial law, which was either a real distinction or entirely invented, and Maya honestly wasn't sure, but Sevikhorn was answering it, which meant it was real enough, but Maya herself had run out of engineered problems to solve. The dish was set. The noise field was running. The signal was gone, out there in the relay chain, and now it just had to arrive. She hated this part, the part where you had done everything you could, and the rest of it was up to someone else's attention. She ate a protein bar she didn't taste, looked at the kitchen porthole. The Vorkai ship sat in Bay 2, darker than the dark around it, shaped like something that had grown rather than been built, all long curves and no sharp edges, the kind of design that was never meant to look threatening, but somehow did anyway, the way very patient things often do. She thought about Sevikhorn's face during the review session, the way his secondary eyes kept finding the kitchen window and then moving on. He knew something was off. She could feel it. He was a thorough person. The Vorkai were all thorough, and thorough people, in her experience, didn't settle for an answer that had the wrong texture. He had one answer that had the wrong texture. The equipment malfunction. She had made it as convincing as she could, but she had been working fast and with limited components, and Sevikhorn had been counting variables for longer than she'd been alive. 10 hours. Item 42. She passed a note. At the 9-hour mark, Sevikhorn requested a second recess. This one was longer. 22 minutes. Maya tracked it. She had pulled the common room's environmental sensors on her tablet and was watching the heat signatures in the corridor. Vorkai ran slightly warm for their size, denser metabolic rate. It was in the biology profile she'd read. 6 signatures huddled in the corridor outside, tighter than the first recess, which meant they weren't just discussing. They were deciding. She knew what there was to decide. The methodology question had been nagging at her since hour 6. If Sevikhorn concluded that they had transmitted and were stalling for the response, his cleanest move was to cut the review short. He could cite inadequate procedural good faith. It was a thin argument. The humans had engaged the review genuinely by any technical reading, but the Vorkai wrote the mandates, which meant they had some latitude in interpreting them. If he cut the review, he was moving to force compliance with 8 hours left on the deadline. 8 hours was not enough time. Unless the signal had already arrived. Unless someone was already reading it. Unless the authority had already started the response chain, and It was just traveling back toward them through the same relay network, slower than she needed it to be. She didn't know. She had no way to know. The dish was receive-capable, but the Vorkai interference still covered inbound standard frequencies, which was the channel any official authority response would come on. She was, for the first time in 72 hours, genuinely stuck. She looked at the toolkit on the counter beside her. She looked at the porthole. She thought about the relay buoy 12 light minutes out. The one she'd logged herself 3 months ago on a boring afternoon when she'd been mapping the network. She knew its broadcast frequency. She knew its signal profile. A relay buoy received and retransmitted automatically. It didn't originate, it just passed along. If the authority had responded, the response was sitting in the buoy's retransmission queue right now, waiting to be pushed through the network. The Vorkai interference blocked inbound signals at the station. It did not block the buoy itself. The buoy was outside the interference radius. She couldn't receive the buoy from inside the station. She looked at the climbing harness hanging on the hook by the exterior door. She looked at her tablet, ran a fast calculation on suit battery life, clamp endurance, how far she could walk along the station's exterior hull on magnetic boots before the cold became a problem. The external sensor array had a passive receive node on the aft dorsal panel. She found it when she'd been cataloging the station's components 2 years ago during another boring afternoon. That predated the station's main comm system and ran on a completely separate frequency band. Old tech, pre-interference, the kind of hardware nobody thought about because it hadn't been actively used since the station upgraded its comms. If she could physically reach the node, patch a direct read cable from it to her tablet, she could pull the buoy's retransmission log directly, bypassing the interference entirely. She had done stupider things than walking on the outside of the space station at -40. She had technically done exactly this thing twice before. She took the harness off the hook. Her father found her suited up at the exterior lock. He looked at her, at the harness, at the cable in her hand. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He stood there for a moment, running calculations. She could see it, the specific arithmetic of a parent who has learned, 11 years in, that stopping her was usually less effective than understanding what she was doing and helping her do it safely. "How long outside?" he asked. 20 minutes, if the aft dorsal panel access plate is where I think it is. It's where you think it is. I serviced it in March. He paused. The fourth magnetic clamp on the port walkway is loose. Don't weight it. Note it. When you get to the node, he said, the direct read jack is on the lower left of the panel. Old coupling. You'll need the 7mm adapter. She checked her kit. She had a 7mm adapter. She had it because she had assembled her kit comprehensively when she was 9 years old, reading every piece of maintenance documentation the station had, cataloging every tool that was ever listed for exterior work. He looked at her kit. He looked at her. "Come back in one piece," he said. "That's the only rule." "Always," she said. He helped her check her seals. The cold was a physical weight. Not pain. Exactly, more like pressure. The universe pressing in from every direction, reminding you that it was enormous, and you were small, and the only thing between you and the full, honest truth of hard vacuum was 40 millimeters of suit material, and your own extremely stubborn refusal to accept the situation. She loved it out here. She always had. Something about the scale was honest. She moved along the hull, magnetic clamps thocking against metal with each step, a sound she felt more than heard because sound didn't carry in vacuum, and the thocking was vibration through the suit, through her boots, up into her shins. Stars in every direction. The Vorkai ship a dark curve in her peripheral vision, sitting in Bay 2. Fourth clamp on the port walkway. Loose. She stepped over it. The aft dorsal panel was exactly where she thought it was. Her father's maintenance records said port stern, aft of the secondary sensor cluster, and she triangulated the location 3 months ago from the station's blueprint documentation as an exercise because she had been bored. She reached it, popped the access plate with her utility tool, found the jack, lower left, old coupling. 7mm adapter. Slow breath. Fit it. Locked. Cable from a jack to her tablet, running through the suit's external data port. A port she had installed herself, with her father's help, 2 years ago because she had wanted to do field data collection and the standard suit didn't have one. She pulled up the receive program, set it to read the buoy's retransmission frequency. Waiting. The log loaded. There were 7 messages in the buoy's queue, all inbound toward Kepler 9. 6 were routine, shipping notifications, a maintenance bulletin, an automated authority system update. The 7th had a priority flag, a real one, an official RIM authority priority code, not the one she'd hand-coded. This one was generated by an actual authority system, which meant it was real and authenticated, and it had her station designation on it. And it had been sitting in the buoy queue for 4 hours and 14 minutes, waiting to route through a network that the Vorkai were currently blocking. She opened it. It was 12 lines. Dense and official in that way authority communications always were built for legal precision rather than human reading. But she had been reading this language for 3 days, and she understood every word of it. The exemption had been verified. Mandate 7 was void within Kepler 9's 12 light-minute residency radius, retroactive to the mandate's filing date. The Vorkai diplomatic vessel was in violation of the verified exemption zone. A formal notice of violation was being transmitted to the Vorkai diplomatic registry. RIM Authority Enforcement was dispatching a response vessel. Estimated arrival, 6 hours. 6 hours. She checked the time. She had 7 hours left on the Vorkai deadline. 1 hour margin. She stood on the hull of her station in the cold and the dark and the wall-to-wall stars, and she felt the margin like something solid. 1 hour was not a lot. 1 hour was exactly enough. She disconnected the cable, stowed it, closed the access panel, started walking back. Her father met her at the lock. He helped her unseal. She handed him the tablet with the authority message already open. He read it. His face did the complicated thing again, terrified and proud, cooking up something that looked like awe. His hands, when he took the tablet, were not quite steady. 6 hours, he said. 7 on the deadline. We have a margin. He looked up at her. He looked like he was going to say something important. He looked like he was choosing very carefully between about 8 different things, all of them true. Go warm up, he said. I'll brief the team. The last 7 hours of the review session were different. Not in any visible way. Dr. Okafor kept asking questions. Sevikorn kept answering them. The log kept running. But the quality of the waiting had changed. Maya could feel in herself the difference between waiting while falling and waiting while standing. She passed notes, ate another protein bar, made tea in the kitchen because the coffee maker was Dr. Okafor's, and it felt wrong to use it without asking. At hour 3 of the final stretch, she saw Sevikorn go still. Not his usual still, not the patient, calculating stillness. A different kind, the stillness of something arriving. His secondary eyes came to the kitchen window and stayed there. She looked back at him through the glass. He knew. She could see it in the specific quality of the stillness. His ship had received the authority notification, even through the interference. A formal diplomatic violation notice came on a hardened channel that the Vorkai protocol required them to keep open because closing it would be itself a violation. He had it. He was reading it. He was recalculating, and this time the variables were coming up wrong. She held his gaze. She was 11 years old and sitting on a kitchen stool with a tablet in her lap and a tea mug between her hands. She was not doing anything dramatic. She was just sitting there, looking back at him, the way she looked at everything steadily, with attention, cataloging. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, his secondary eyes moved on. The review session ended 22 minutes before the Vorkai deadline. Sevikorn stood. His delegation stood. He looked at Aiden Reyes and Dr. Okafor and said, in his translation echo voice, "We acknowledge the residency exemption as valid under Mandate 7 subsection 14. Kepler, 9 falls outside our territorial claim. We will file the appropriate corrections with the diplomatic registry." Dr. Okafor said, "We appreciate your thorough engagement with the review process." Sevikorn said, "Yes." He looked at the kitchen window one more time. Maya was still sitting there. She gave him a small nod, the kind that meant nothing, and everything, the kind that doesn't require translation. He held it for a moment. Then he turned and led his delegation back to Bay 2. The Vorkai ship undocked at hour 47 of the 48-hour window, 1 hour before deadline, 1 hour before the authority response vessel arrived, which meant they never had to be in the same space, which Maya thought was probably good for everyone's diplomatic blood pressure. The crew gathered on the observation deck to watch the ship go, all 12 of them, Reyes and Okafor and Hessa and Yun, and the other 6 who had spent 3 days running background support and backup systems and a lot of coffee. The ship moved out of Bay 2, cleared the station's shadow, and then just went with that cold Vorkai efficiency, no waste, no drama, accelerating out toward the dark with the precise purposefulness of a species that had never once in their history left anything to chance. Except this time they had. They had counted every variable except the one who had been sitting in the kitchen. The authority response vessel arrived 53 minutes later. Commander Voss was a broad, tired-looking woman who had clearly been in transit the entire 6 hours and was running on emergency rations and professional obligation. She shook Reyes's hand. She reviewed the documentation. She certified the exemption. She filed the Vorkai violation report. Then, she said, "Who sent the signal?" Reyes stepped back, looked at Maya, who was standing at the edge of the group with her red backpack on and her team mug still in hand. "That would be my daughter," he said. Commander Voss looked at her. The look was the kind that comes from a person who has spent a career in rim enforcement and has seen most things but is experiencing, in real time, the revision of one of their assumptions. "How old are you?" 11, Maya said. 12 in April. Voss looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "You modified the dish manually," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd read the transmission data. "The automated calibration system was broken," Maya said. "Dad was going to look at it when he had time." Voss looked at Reyes. Reyes had the expression of a man who knew he deserved that. "You found the exemption clause." "I was bored," Maya said. "The station library is 3 years out of date. I've been reading primary sources. You build a noise field to mask the modified frequency." Engineer Yun helped. Yun, from the back of the group, raised a hand briefly in acknowledgement. "You read the buoy log from the exterior hull." "I installed the external data port on my suit 2 years ago," Maya said. "I wanted to do field collection, and the standard suit didn't support it." Voss was quiet for a long moment, doing the kind of math that isn't about numbers. "The Vorkai interference field," she said. "You solve around it 3 different ways." 4, Maya said. "There's also the review session stall, but that was mostly Dr. Okafor." Dr. Okafor, from beside Reyes, smiled in a way that was not modest at all. 4 ways, Voss said. "The Vorkai are very good at blocking standard approaches," Maya said. "They're not as good at accounting for non-standard ones. I think that's because their variable counts assume the other party is operating on the same logic model. They don't account for," she paused, looking for the right word, "people who break things and fix them and break them differently," she said finally. "People who use the wrong frequency because the right one was broken. That kind of thing." Voss looked at her for another long moment. "Do you want a job?" she said. Reyes made a sound. "She's 11, he said. "I am aware." Voss kept her eyes on Maya. "In about 7 years. Later, after Voss left, after the documentation was filed, after the crew had the kind of loose, tired dinner that follows 3 days of sustained dread, Maya went back to the observation deck. She sat in the magnetic clamp chair with her parka on. No crackers this time. Just the stars hard in blue and wall-to-wall, and the dark between them that she had stopped registering as dark a long time ago, because once you looked long enough, it was full of things, relay buoys and shipping lanes and signal chains and the specific frequency bands that carried messages across light minutes like small persistent promises. She thought about Sevicorn, about the moment he'd looked at her through the kitchen window and gone still, about the recalculation she'd watched happen behind his obsidian eyes, the variables that hadn't come up right. The Vorkai had run every number, counted every person, filed every manifest, planned for every standard response from a 12-person RIM station facing a diplomatic deadline with jammed communications and no leverage and no options. They had not planned for the option that showed up in a ratty red backpack and had been for the last 9 years the loneliest kid in the RIM, reading every database the station had, mapping every relay node in the local network, cataloging every ship profile that passed, building tools she needed because the standard ones didn't exist yet, talking to the satellite dish on the roof because there was nobody else around. She had not been bored. She had been building something. She hadn't known that was what she was doing. She'd just been doing the next thing, and the next, and the next, the way you do when the universe is enormous and you are small, and the only honest response to that equation is to learn as much of it as you possibly can. The Vorkai ship was gone. The stars were the same, as always. She sat with them for a while. Then she went inside to sleep because she had earned it, because tomorrow there would be new ships to log, new frequencies to study, new things to know about a galaxy that kept being larger and stranger and more interesting than anyone had finished mapping yet. She had a feeling she was going to need to know all of it. She had a feeling she was going to be fine.